Good afternoon, everybody. It's 12:15, so I think we will begin. My name is Norman Ho. I teach here at Peking University School of Transnational Law, or we call ourselves STL for short, School of Transnational Law, STL. I'd like to welcome everybody here in the classroom, and also like to welcome everybody on Zoom who's joining to this public lecture in our STL public lecture series. We're extremely honored and privileged today to not just have one speaker, but two great speakers today, Professor Kevin Brown and Professor Ahmed Lavalais. Professor Brown is the Mitchell Willoughby Professor of Law at the University of South Carolina, and he has also taught at Indiana University Maurer School of Law for many years, and is a scholar of race and law, law and education, and torts, and of course of immense pride to us at STL is a visiting professor here at the Peking University School of Transnational Law. And we're also privileged to be joined also by Professor Ahmed Lavalais, who is a law professor at the University of Cincinnati College of Law. Professor Lavalais' research interests include looking at how social ideologies and race influence the U.S. criminal legal justice system. He also has a wealth of professional experience in this area, for example, serving as policy director in the Civil Rights Division of a major U.S. prosecutorial office. And has also widely published in his research areas of interest. Professor Brown and Professor Lavalais will speak today on the topic of the rearticulation of the white man's burden and the African American response. They're going to speak for about 40 to 45 minutes in total, after which we will open the floor for questions. I would like to give the floor now to Professors Lavalais and Brown.
Hopefully I can wield the microphone and use my laptop effectively at the same time. First and foremost, thank you very much for inviting both of us, and specifically for inviting me all the way from Cincinnati. Thank you to the faculty and students here at STL, and particular thanks to Professors Ho and Brown for inviting me. I'm deeply honored to be here. So I'm going to, in the interest of time, dive right in. So the title of our talk is The Rearticulation of the White Man's Burden and the African American Response. The White Man's Burden is, of course, the title of an infamous poem by British Nobel laureate Rudyard Kipling. Kipling himself, born in 1865 in British-controlled India, and an enthusiastic imperialist and white supremacist. The notion of the white man's burden describes a particular formulation of white supremacy, one which existed well before and long after Kipling's work. It is the development of this notion of white peoples as burdened in their historic and political interactions, historic and political and legal interactions with non-whites that makes up the first part of our talk. White supremacy is, of course, a deeply iterative construct, but within that, it maintains over time three basic tenets. Those can be simply articulated as follows. First, race is understood in white supremacist constructs as biologically dispositive. Second, the white race is understood as superior to other racial groups. And third, the white race is understood as threatened by other racial groups. Non-white thinkers have long identified white supremacy as a political project. And all political projects are marked by a series of moralizing, justificatory pronouncements, an articulation of the reasons why the political project should be understood as morally praiseworthy. White supremacy's first broad justification was arguably the doctrine of discovery, wherein religious and political officials sought to legitimate theft of non-white land by articulating the goal of European domination as the saving of non-white souls through forced conversion to Christianity. By the 19th century, as European technological superiority led to white domination of a majority of the planet, the justifications for white control became increasingly varied, but ultimately centered around the notion that non-whites were childlike savages who benefited from white oversight. Put differently, Dominating non-white lives and territories was broadly articulated as an act of benevolence on the part of whites. Well into the 19th century, some version of the notion of white benevolence served as the principal justification for the maintenance of white dominion. While non-whites had, of course, resisted white control for hundreds of years, the 19th century saw the first sustained and successful repudiations of white supremacy and its underlying justification of benevolence. By the end of the 19th century, white supremacist thinkers needed a new justification for their project. The myth and sham of benevolence had been cracked. White supremacy, at least as a political project in the United States, required a new justificatory articulation, a rearticulation. Eventually, in the aftermath of the U.S. Civil War, white supremacist political actors found what they were looking for. The freeing of black slaves was framed by the defeated states of the Confederacy as a mortal danger to white lives. White supremacy recalibrated its moral justification for white domination from benevolent hegemony to self-defense, promoting a vision of the modern world where the unchaining of persons of color marked an existential threat to whiteness. It is that shift, the move from describing white supremacy as a project of benevolence to describing it as a project of self-defense, that I hope to elucidate. In the simplest and most common iterations, white supremacist philosophies frame non-whites as either childlike savages or criminalistic predators. These framings will be, for many, immediately familiar. In U.S. law, they have influenced the development of nearly every subfield, from education to immigration, from housing to banking, from property to policing. The defining of non-whites as uncivilized savages incapable of self-determination, or as preternaturally violent criminals, runs like a vast substructure informing and supporting huge swaths of U.S. law. Part of our project here is to better understand the history those framings emerged from and how subordinated groups constructed their counter-narratives. As a system of moral and socio-political thought, white supremacy's most recognizable early articulations can be traced to key thinkers of the European Enlightenment. Figures such as George Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, Thomas Hobbes, David Hume, Immanuel Kant, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and many others, over a period of roughly 200 years, laid out the basic philosophical armament that helped support and validate European imperialism, settler colonialism, and race-based enslavement. Scottish philosopher David Hume, writing in the mid-18th century, suggested that Negroes, meaning black people, had never produced a civilized nation or demonstrated any capacity for science, government, or art. Social contract theory, as articulated by figures such as Thomas Hobbes, John Locke, and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, offered a vision of socio-political life structured around whiteness. Only persons understood to be civilized could partake in the social contract, and only white persons, according to these thinkers, had the capacities required for civilization. Hegel wrote that there was a right of European heroes to colonize non-white lands and dominate the peoples there so that European Christians could bring freedom to non-white territories. The moral theory of Immanuel Kant is of particular relevance in understanding the development of white supremacist framings. According to Kant, moral worth flows from the autonomy of persons. Inherent in this autonomy is the capacity to set goals and ends for oneself. Inanimate objects, non-human animals, and human children all lack the capacity to competently choose what they desire in life, and thus, according to Kant, it is acceptable to treat them with diminished respect, and to afford them a more limited set of rights. Scholars have demonstrated, though, that Kant's moral system, for all its beauty and evocation of an intrinsic human dignity, was written with the understanding that it applied only to white persons. non-white persons because they were conceived of in these systems as non-human or lower order humans or sub-persons or naive child savages or non-civilized are not afforded the full dignity and rights put forth in Kant's moral system. These ideas provided key support for the seizure of non-white territories and for the enslavement of non-whites by positioning white rule as a natural or divinely ordained outcome and as an ultimately benevolent project, one that burdened the biologically and culturally superior whites with the role of paternalistic world caretaker and overseer. More simply, these philosophers helped reframe a story that, at least as a moral matter, should have been about what white people were doing to non-white people, that is to say, stealing, killing, enslaving, into a story about what white people were doing for non-white people. The movement to abolish slavery marked a critical shift in the socio-legal discourse of white supremacy in the United States. The first nation to genuinely repudiate slavery in the Atlantic world was Haiti. By 1804, black slaves in what had been the French slaving colony of Saint-Domingue realized the culmination of their decades-long rebellion, ousting the French and emancipating all enslaved persons within the territory. The Haitian success generated paroxysms of horror among white political elites across much of the Atlantic world. Over the course of the Haitian Revolution, black military forces defeated the French, the Spanish, and the British, the three most powerful nations in the world at that time. For many white political leaders in the United States, the Haitian Revolution was the literal embodiment of their own long-standing fear of a black-led slave revolt. The U.S. federal government responded to the Haitian Revolution with a mix of racialized cultural contempt and realpolitik. President Thomas Jefferson referred to the Haitian forces as cannibals. But after it became clear that the Haitians were a potentially useful wedge in always looming conflicts with the French, British, and Spanish, Jefferson offered a degree of aid to the Haitians. Moreover, Jefferson saw ongoing conflict in Haiti as potentially lucrative for the United States, particularly in the form of weapons sales. Nevertheless, Jefferson and his immediate Federalist predecessors also felt it necessary to isolate Haiti. In consultation with the French, British, and Spanish, U.S. presidential administrations maintained various blockades of Haiti, severely undermining their economic development and tightly constraining Haiti's ability to interact on the world stage. The symbolic effect of these blockades was also quite powerful. Haitians were not welcomed anywhere in the Atlantic world. The blockades can be understood as a kind of imprisonment. They communicated to the rest of the Atlantic world that the Haitians were dangerous. They implied that what the Haitians had done, that is, kill white people who intended to enslave them, were criminal acts. This criminalizing of black emancipation foreshadowed the key shift in how U.S. white supremacy would construct non-whites over the next 100 years. Notably, contemporaneous white-made drawings of the leaders of the Haitian Revolution and other famous Haitian men of the day often depicted these men with exaggerated sex organs, hinting at the supposed sexual danger that would accompany black emancipation. This later becomes an important element of white supremacy's rearticulation into a project of self-defense. By the mid-19th century in the United States, Haiti was largely forgotten, but the issue of slavery was the dominant political concern. The nation was expanding westward, and it had become clear that the country could not maintain its legally contradictory framework of enslavement in some states and freedom in others. Pro-slavery forces leaned on the construction of enslavement as an act of benevolence. They regularly pointed to legal codes that technically outlawed the physical abuse of slaves, and to the requirement that slaves attend Christian church services as examples of slave owners' benevolence. Now, even if one were to take the were to take the laws barring the mistreatment of slaves seriously, the broader legal framework made such laws unenforceable. Non-whites, and especially enslaved non-whites, were legally forbidden from testifying in court against whites. Non-whites were also generally barred from sitting on juries, from practicing law, and from being judges or magistrates. So pressing such an abuse claim faced an insurmountable set of legal hurdles. The anti-slavery narrative, for its part, was far more visceral and rooted in an easily demonstrable reality. Enslaved blacks were regularly brutalized, and this brutalization was a key part of the argument against slavery. In particular, sexual violation of slaves was commonplace. Early 19th century U.S. legal structures incentivized the sexual assault of enslaved women. The codification of the one-drop rule, a form of hypodescent where mixed-race offspring were ascribed the status of their lowest-ranking parent, made it disturbingly easy for slave owners to create more slaves. All a slave owner need do was rape their female slaves. The resulting offspring became their slave property. The widespread sexual abuse of slaves served as a visceral narrative that easily countered the myth of benevolence. By 1857, the slavery question was quickly coming to a head. Violent conflicts over the status of slavery, which included whites fighting both for and against slavery, were tearing at the nation. The U.S. Supreme Court, in an attempt to settle the matter, issued its infamous Dred Scott v. Sandford opinion. In Dred Scott, of course, the court held that Scott, and all black people, were ineligible for citizenship in the United States. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney, author of the court's opinion, put the matter in starkly white supremacist terms. Because Scott and his family were black, Taney wrote, they had no rights which the white man was bound to respect. While many scholars believe Chief Justice Taney had hoped the Dred Scott opinion would entrench slavery, the court's opinion in Dred Scott only inflamed matters. The Southern states soon seceded, formed the short-lived Confederate States of America, and were ultimately defeated in the U.S. Civil War. The Civil War settled the slavery question, but white supremacy in the post-war United States was far from defeated. That said, the Civil War and the abolition of slavery had struck a deeply damaging blow to the internal and external understandings of white supremacy as a political project. If the U.S. was to be a white supremacist nation, as in the late 19th century it intended to still be, it would have to reorganize its understanding of white supremacy. The answer to this dilemma would come from the disaffected Southerners. What was arguably most threatening about abolition to pro-slavery white supremacists was the assertion that enslaved blacks were, and always had been, human beings, equal in all moral regards to whites. In affirming the humanity of black people and non-whites more broadly, abolition did more than repudiate slavery. It cast slavery's supporters as moral criminals. Beyond losing the war, Southern white supremacists and slavery supporters beyond the South had lost precious ground in the pseudo-moral accounting upon which so much of politics rests. Black people were now discussed in some influential political circles as innocent victims of the slaveholders. Southern white supremacists were now kidnappers, rapists, and child abusers. Suddenly finding themselves vilified in key aspects of the post-war discourse as brutalizers of the innocent, pro-slavery white supremacists recognized a need to demonstrate the supposed veracity of their moral claims regarding the intrinsically different and lesser nature of the racial other. This rhetorical reframing was needed both to justify the reimposition of white domination in the post-Civil War South and to distance Southern white supremacists from the now morally tainted practice of slaving. No longer able to rely exclusively on the thin myth of benevolent enslavement, Southern white supremacist political actors quickly found what they were looking for in the fundamentally moralizing language and rationales of criminal law. Racialized criminalization, codified through de jure legal creations such as convict leasing and validated through the self-defense rhetoric used to justify lynching, quickly came to function as a retroactive vindication of white domination of Southern blacks. Even if white supremacists were forced by the Civil War to concede, at least officially, that black people were in fact human beings, they could still, through manufactured criminalization, demonstrate that black people were not innocent human beings. This subtle discursive shift allowed Southern white supremacists to suggest that whatever victimization black people had experienced under slavery was a necessary exertion of control over an inherently predatory and criminalistic group, and that whatever violence the post-slavery criminal system did to blacks was justifiable for the same reasons. White supremacist elements within government, the legal system, academia, and popular media coalesced and mobilized around a narrative that framed Southern whites as desperately vulnerable to victimization at the hands of presumptively criminal blacks. By equating blackness with criminality, and in particular with sexual violence, white supremacists leveraged their control of the criminal system to help further the more general claim that black people held within themselves something essentially degraded, uncivilized, and animalistic. In this way, the criminalization of blackness not only reinforced white social, economic, and political dominance in the post-war South, it helped Southern white supremacists reassert or redeem their tarnished moral status. The ultimate message of Southern white supremacy's post-war rearticulation was that all whites, not just Southern whites, were endangered by abolition, which, according to the would-be Confederates, had unleashed the ravaging criminal nature of black people upon peaceable whites. Here, we find the rearticulation. The criminal law becomes the prism through which the new racial order is managed. Law students will, of course, be familiar with the basic justifications for punishment articulated in U.S. criminal law courses, those being retribution, deterrence, and rehabilitation. More recently, though, proponents of mass incarceration have endorsed incapacitation as a principal rationale for punishment, the idea being that persons who commit serious crimes are inherently criminal. This idea has its roots in the post-Civil War articulation of non-whites as inherently criminal. The framing of non-whites as criminalistic was applied with some minor nuance to all non-white groups. In 1875, for example, Congress passed the Page Act. The Page Act, which prohibited the importation of Asian laborers and women from Asia said to be migrating for immoral purposes, was enforced primarily against persons from China. The language of the act was steeped in the idea that non-whites, regardless of gender or geography, contained inherently criminal natures. The law suggested that non-white women, in this case Asian women, are possessed of animalistic libidos and immoral sexual habits. Soon thereafter, in 1882, the more well-known Chinese Exclusion Act was passed. Much of the debate around the Page Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act was steeped in accusations that Asians were, by their natures, criminal, and that interacting with them would expose whites to danger. From the perspective of the rearticulated white supremacist politic, the Page Act and the Chinese Exclusion Act were acts of self-defense. The paradigmatic example of this rhetorical refinement can be found in the practice of lynching in the United States. Sexual violence had long operated as a key means of demonstrating the extent of white male control over non-whites. Settler colonialism and slavery maintained a distinctly sexual backdrop as non-whites were forced to endure generations of sexual violence, with the rape of Native American and black women and children being commonplace. In an especially brazen turn, U.S. white supremacist thinkers and politicians, in response to the end of legalized slavery, began to argue that inherently animalistic blacks would turn into rapists upon slavery's end. Here, white supremacy flips the reality of the rape narrative on its head, as Southern white supremacists, after centuries of sexual violence against non-whites, sought to cast themselves as vulnerable to the supposedly inherent sexual violence of those same non-whites. Accusations of the rape of white women by black men, almost always either flatly untrue or without anything approaching credible evidence and certainly no due process, became the predominant underlying justification for the mass terrorization and criminalization of black people in the post-war South. White supremacists leveraged their control of the criminal system to help promote their claim that black people and non-whites more generally held within themselves something essentially animalistic. This claim helped instill and reinforce the notion that the end of slavery had put whites in danger. Many times, the understood incitement to a lynching was known to be political or economic. For example, black men were lynched for maintaining successful businesses that competed with white-owned businesses, for attempting to vote, and for encouraging other blacks to vote. The accusation of sexually assaulting a white woman was a useful mechanism to justify extra-legal violence that achieved ends which had nothing to do with the safety of white women and girls. And while most lynchings occurred in the South and targeted black people, there were lynchings all over the country, with Latinos, Native Americans, and persons of Asian descent being the most common non-black targets. In the late 19th and early 20th century, lynching was actively promoted, widely acknowledged, and frequently put forward as a source of pride in Southern white supremacist discourses, including by the press and by lawmakers. So at this point, both the de jure and the de facto legal structures across the United States have codified the notion that non-whites are inherently dangerous to whites. Lynching is the de facto law of the South, and immigration is structured around an articulation of non-whites, especially persons from Asia, as inherently threatening to white safety. The discourse between benevolent hegemony and white self-defense is on full display when the United States makes its first imperialistic foray beyond the Atlantic world. By the end of the 19th century, the U.S. was poised to take control of the Philippines after the brief Spanish-American War. President McKinley issued his benevolent assimilation proclamation, wherein McKinley promises the United States will benevolently rule over the Philippines. The only problem was that the Filipinos had already declared independence. The U.S. refused to acknowledge Filipino independence and quickly turned to the work of framing Filipino resistance as a criminal act. Part of the U.S. project was to use courts of justice, wherein Filipino jurists were replaced by American officials to determine who and what was and was not a crime. These courts were initially run by the military, but eventually by persons trained in the U.S., and they sought to project a veneer of civilization. Assertions of Filipino independence or right to self-determination were criminalized. The courts branded many Filipinos as bandits or insurgents. More than this, the criminal courts added to the suggestion of an inherent criminality within the Filipino people, much as criminal law in the Jim Crow South did with blacks, and the immigration laws of the day did with Chinese. Blending elements of stereotypes found in the Page Act, the Chinese Exclusion Act, and Southern lynch law, the U.S.-run courts in the Philippines put forward a narrative that simultaneously suggested that the Filipinos, because they were not white, were incapable of self-governance and predisposed to criminality. In this sense, the benevolent hegemony and self-defense narratives worked in concert. Filipinos are ultimately given a stark set of options: submit to white domination or be criminalized. Back in the United States, black intellectuals in the late 19th and early 20th centuries are increasingly attuned to the racialized nature of events playing out across Asia. The U.S. engagement in the Philippines, the Russo-Japanese War, the Indian fight against British ascendancy, and the Boxer Rebellion are all watched attentively. As Black intellectuals survey the early 20th century landscape, a pattern presents itself. White imperialist powers are unwilling to accept non-whites on equal terms. Non-white resistance to domination has been reframed as criminality. Professor Brown will now take over and discuss the response from early 20th century Black intellectuals.
Thank you for that. So I'm going to pick up with this idea of this change of beginning to see people of color as a threat. But instead what I'm going to do is give you the reaction from the African American community. And I have to say, this is my second trip here to STL. I have wanted to talk about race with people here for a long time, because the African American perspective is a very different perspective on American society. So let me begin that when I think about the African American condition, the original way that we thought about ourselves when we were enslaved was that we were descendants of the children of Israel. So we analogized ourselves to the enslavement of the children of Israel in Egypt. And something I don't think really gets appreciated is that during the American Civil War, Black troops were essential to the victory of the North and the defeat of slavery. It wasn't that Black people were given freedom. It was that Black people won freedom. Both Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses S. Grant, who was the head of the Union Army, both made it point publicly to say, without the Black troops, we would not have won the war. In reward for that, a number of 3 different amendments were added to the U.S. Constitution and 5 major civil rights bills after the end of the Civil War in 1865. Although, as my good friend Ahmed has pointed out, as this view of people of color as a threat began to take hold, by the late 1890s, a growing pessimism about white supremacy had begun to take root in the Black community. And Ahmed had mentioned several important international developments, including the 1898 Spanish-American War and the territories populated with people of color in the Philippines and Puerto Rico that all of a sudden became possessions of the United States. But as a result of all of this, a new international view of the African American situation was beginning to formulate. It was against the background of this emerging new pessimism that Black intellectuals and political leaders viewed what was called the Boxer Rebellion. For us, this represented the reality that other people of color were willing to take up arms and fight against white supremacy. Soon after the Boxer Rebellion, the Japanese defeated the Russians in the 1904-1905 Russo-Japanese War. It is this victory over Russia that raised a new idea among Black intellectuals and political actors, and that was the possibility of a global alliance of people of color against white supremacy. Before the Russo-Japanese War, the view of the Black community about Japan mirrored that of the American society in general. But Japan's victory changed the view of the Black community about Japan overnight. No group of Americans celebrated the Japanese victory more than the Black community. Even though Black leaders were divided in their approach to the current problems of the Black community, they were united in their estimate of the significance of Japan's rise to power. The fact that a colored nation had defeated a mighty European power instilled a sense of pride in African Americans. The Black press and several African American leaders, and I know you may not know the names, but believe me, these are the leaders of leaders. W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Mary Church Terrell, and Marcus Garvey, just to name a few, cheered the victory of the Japanese over the Russians. Indeed, as Du Bois himself would put it, for the first time in 1,000 years, a great white nation has measured arms with a colored nation and has been found wanting. The Russo-Japanese War marks an epic, The magic of the word white is already broken. The awakening of the yellow races is certain. That the awakening of the brown and black races will follow in time, no unprejudiced student of history can doubt. Shall the awakening of these sleepy millions be in accordance with and aided by the great ideals of white civilization, or in spite of them and against them? This is the problem of the color line. In the years leading up to World War I, black leaders increasingly saw their condition as a local battle in a global war against white supremacy. For example, Du Bois commented upon the Chinese Revolution that toppled the Manchu dynasty by noting that a reawakened China would also challenge the myth of white supremacy. Also during World War I, several Indian intellectuals and freedom fighters came to the U.S. seeking support for Indian independence movement. Of these, Lajpat Rai, known as the Lion of Punjab, deserves special mention. Rai was a lawyer and the president of the Bar Association of India, and he founded the India Home Rule League of America to advocate for self-rule for India. Rai visited the United States for 5 years, from December 1914 to 1919. Touring the country, Rai made a point of studying the American racial situation. He became personally acquainted with the most significant black leaders of the time, including Booker T. Washington, John Hope, and Mary Ovington. Rai also developed a close friendship with W.E.B. Du Bois, primarily based on the notion of analogizing Indian independence and black equality. Du Bois and Rai saw black people fighting white supremacy in the form of segregation, discrimination, and disenfranchisement, while India fought white supremacy in terms of British colonialism. After World War I, a prominent group of black delegates, including, and once again, these really are the names of names, Marcus Garvey, Adam Clayton Powell Jr., A. Philip Randolph, and Madam C.J. Walker, created the International League of Darker Peoples to make a direct appeal to the Japanese delegation. Their goal was to meet with the Japanese delegation to seek assurances that Japan would acknowledge the plight of black people in the U.S. and work to remove race prejudice and race discrimination all around the globe. They were assured that Japan would raise the issue of racial discrimination at Versailles before the conference began. Also, in preparation of the peace conference, Du Bois organized a global Pan-African conference that took place in Paris in February 1919, and it was attended by delegates of 15 countries. In the 1920s, the black community increasingly supported the Indian freedom fighters. No single individual had a greater impact in shaping the black community's understanding of Indian independence than Mohandas K. Gandhi. After spending 2 years in prison on sedition charges, Gandhi became the president of the Congress Party in 1924. In July 1929, Gandhi published a message to the black community in the Crisis magazine, which was the most significant magazine of all time in the Negro community. In the message, Gandhi urged the 12 million Negroes not to be ashamed of being grandchildren of slaves. There was no dishonor in this. The dishonor was being that of the slave owners. By the mid-1920s, the black people were viewing their struggle against white supremacy as part of a global struggle against white supremacy. There was no question, however, that black leaders clearly began to doubt the intentions of the Japanese and whether they could be trusted after their invasion of Manchuria. They worried that the Japanese may simply be another imperial power mimicking European imperialism. However, the idea of a global fight against white supremacy persisted through the end of World War II. Several developments after World War II have led to a waning of the importance of the idea of the global struggle against white supremacy in the Black community. Briefly, those would include the Cold War, which made it virtually impossible for any Black leader to support any Marxist or non-aligned country, the creation of the United Nations and human rights rhetoric. The human rights rhetoric redirected the concerns of former colonies away from the exploitation of white supremacy to the failures of their own self-created governments. The end of European colonialism struck at the heart of the global alliance of people of color, for it is one thing to fight against colonialism, it's another when the concerns are about independence. And then, of course, for the Black community, the success of the civil rights struggle. Norman, here's where I need to. As of 2019, almost 40% in the United States of the people are people of color. Below the age of 18 right now, a majority of the people in the United States are people of color. And projections are that by 2040, 15 years, 16 years from now, a majority of Americans will be people of color, and by 2060, almost 60% will be people of color. While predicting the future is like looking around the corner, and you're never sure what unknown developments can change your view, but what we put forth is the possibility that the United States has a very long history of viewing people of color that they cannot control as threats. As a result, it is inevitable that Americans will view the rise of China as an ominous sign. But this is not a threat that will be in isolation. The changing demographics in the U.S. will also mean that there will be inevitable backlash against people of color in the U.S. This combination has a lot to do with the embrace of Donald Trump. He is viewed by many of his supporters as the last line of defense against the United States being overwhelmed by people of color. And what I want to do to make this point to you is to show you the racial breakdown of the voting for president in the United States in 2012, 2016, and 2020. So 2012 is Romney and Obama. And as you can see, 59% of whites voted for Romney, 39% voted for Obama. And you can also see where blacks, 6% voted for Romney, 93% for Obama. But with Latinos, it was 27% for Romney and 71% for Obama. And with Asians, 26% for Romney and 73%. And the important point to note here is that Romney lost this election by 3 million votes, even though he got 60% of the white vote. In 2016, you can see there 57% of whites voted for Trump, compared to 8% of blacks, 28% of Latinos, and 26% of Asians. Once again, Trump lost the popular vote by 3.5 million votes. The only reason he was elected president is because of the outdated electoral system, which is not going to change. And let me show you this. This is the 2020 election. And there is Trump at 58% of the white vote. And I want to kind of close with this. He got 58% of the white vote, and he lost the election by 7.5 million votes. What is really going on in the United States right now is a tremendous fear that people of color will become the dominant groups in the United States. And that's what explains the rise of Trump.
Thank you so much, Professor Brown, Professor Lavalais.